You are listening to the Justice in Heels podcast with me, your host, Danielle Hayward. Join me as I discuss interesting legal topics with inspiring female legal professionals who paved the way for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of the Justice in Heels podcast. Today, I have Anel Coetzee with me. Anel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much Danielle for having me.
Fantastic. So can you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself?
So I was admitted as an attorney in 2019. I practiced for a couple of years, and then I decided to switch to corporate. I currently work as a legal advisor to the Stallion Group of companies. I really enjoy corporate. I really enjoy the mergers and acquisition space and contract law and things like that. On a more personal front, I was born with what is called CRS. So CRS is congenital rubella syndrome. So this is basically a condition where the fetus contracted the German measles virus while still in the womb. This was back in the 90s. So while my mom was immunized against the German measles virus, by the time she fell pregnant with me, she had no more immunity in her body. And she realized that she taught at a school where they had a German measles outbreak. And she went to the doctors and they told her, you know what, it won't matter. It's too early in the pregnancy. Everything is going to be fine. So obviously, once I was born, I looked fairly healthy. And it was a few months later, they had these, you know, when you're like in your crib and they have these little toy sets hanging over the bed and the little babies play with, you know, all the things that hang down. So I didn't notice them at all, didn't play with them. And they realized that I wasn't focusing. So we started on a very long journey, going from specialist to specialist, and they were all very convinced that it was a neurological issue. So I went for every brain scan you can imagine. And I think this was a really terrible time for my parents. They went through quite a bit, having to learn how to raise a disabled child. And mixed with this was that I was a very active child. And when you can't see, you know, the way you find out about an obstacle is if you walk into it, or the way you find out about a step is if you fall down it. So I was constantly bruised, and every time we'd go to a specialist for another check, they would phone social workers because they were quite convinced at a stage that the problem was really just that I was being abused or something like that. So when I was 5, I had to go to a school, and back then, I don't really know if it's changed today, but back then, there was no such thing as inclusive education. So disabled children were taken out of their home environments and you were placed in a school specially designed for your particular disability. So I was lucky enough with my mom being a teacher, she could move or be closer to my school. So I stayed with my family while growing up. And it was there that we actually went to the Eye Institute, and my mom finally convinced the doctor to test my blood for the German measles virus. Now, what the virus did is it destroyed my retinas, and there's no cure for this. So I had to learn to navigate a world that's not really designed for people with disabilities in mind. And this meant that I needed to learn how to walk with a white cane. I needed to learn to read Braille. And I think by all accounts, and apart from the little modifications we had to make, I grew up fairly normally. I did acrobatic gymnastics, I played piano, I had a lot of friends. I really enjoyed school and I liked learning. And I don't think my disability really started impacting me in the sense that I really felt the difference it made to my life until I was at university. I think growing up, I was so convinced that it was just a normal part of being human that I never really considered how much it affects a person when you grow up away from other children without disabilities. And I think this really hit home for me when I started studying at the University of the Free State, where all of a sudden I went from a class with 5 disabled children to 500 non-disabled students. And you realize how much accommodations you received and how little you have to work with going forward. So I have a very cute guide dog who assists me now in my daily life. So his job is to guide me around from place to place. The purpose of a guide dog is not to take over the sighted parts of your life completely. So when Obi and I walk around, Obi doesn't necessarily know where we're going. It's my responsibility to give him directions. And it's his responsibility to make sure that I don't walk into obstacles, don't trip downstairs, things like that. So what he will do is I will give him certain commands like forward, and we will start walking. When we reach, for example, a step, he will stop with his feet on the top step. And then I will put my foot forward to see why he's stopping. Is it for an obstacle? Is it because of a step? Things like that. And then they perform a function that I refer to as blocking. So basically what will happen is if we approach an elevator or a curb, and I, for example, give him a command to go forward, and he realizes that it's too dangerous, either a car is coming on at a great speed or the elevator doesn't work, he will block my body from moving forward, and I will then take a step back and rather ask a sighted person why the dog isn't walking. And I think that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. So how long have you had your guide dog?
So Obi is actually my second guide dog, and I've had him since 2019, so about 4 years now. My first guide dog was a golden retriever, and we worked together for about 6 years before he retired.
Oh, lovely. So, can you tell us a bit more about your journey as a law student? I assume you faced other issues that, like normal, I want to say normal, students did not face. Can you tell us a bit more?
So I definitely think even today, there's a big gap that disabled students need to breach, that able-bodied students don't have to worry about when they go to university. So in an ideal world, once you apply to go to university, you might be allowed a month before the university starts to go for orientation. So in the ideal world, they will then take you and show you how to walk from your residence to class, how to walk from your class to your support centers, how to navigate campus. They will start helping you to prepare all your study material, get access to your lecturer's slides and things like that. So once university starts, that you can fall in with all the other students and hit the ground running. I think the unfortunate reality is that in most cases, this doesn't happen. So back when I went to university, it was, I think, worse than it is today because we didn't really have electronic books yet. So I went to university from a very small school where I didn't really even need a white cane to walk around. So I went to university thinking that it's going to be more of the same. I didn't grasp how big a campus can be and how many obstacles and challenges there will be. So within the very first month of starting my studies, I phoned my mom and I said to her, I don't think there's a part of my body that's not bruised. I need you to send my white cane. This isn't working. So for me, that was really one of the biggest gaps. If you don't know how to get from point A to point B, how are you expected to complete any courses? How are you expected to show up at class? So that was a very difficult time for me, having to find a way to learn to navigate campus, to find my way from point A to point B, and obviously then also to actually upskill myself to get some proper skills with my white cane, which is another thing that wasn't really enforced when I was in school. So that was the very first challenge I had. And the second challenge I had was accessing my study material. So like I said, we didn't have electronic books. So I thought it would be a good idea to start with Braille because Braille was what I knew from school. And they brought my very first Braille textbook was, I think it was legal history. And we were already heading towards the first test for the semester. And I still didn't have my study material because what would happen is we would have to apply for permission from the publishers to actually translate those books and put them in Braille. So that took a very long time. So while we did that, while we waited for that, we'd go to the library and take out the books in the library. And then you'd pay someone to actually start typing up the books for you so that you could have access to that material. So I remember walking back from the library, it was one day before the test, and they said to me, okay, we have the first few chapters of your legal history textbook, you can come and collect it. So I walked to the library, very proud of myself, finally found my way there. And they put the stack of books in my arms that stood higher than my head from that point. And I walked outside, I was trying to find my way with the cane in front of me. And I walked into something and I was like, what's this? And some guy behind me said, that's a bin. And I was like, oh, good. And I just tipped the whole stack of books into the bin because I was like, it's one day before the exam. There's no way I'm going to get through all those pages in, a night. And it was a really difficult year for me. I think I passed probably 3 of my modules for that year. And I very nearly quit studying at that point. So yeah, by October, I realized I pretty much failed the entire year. And I was so despondent and demotivated. And there wasn't anyone that really knew how to help me or really knew how to make life more accessible. And because I came from a place where we got everything in Braille and that's it was decided for you what would work for you. I didn't actually know what was out there. I didn't know what to ask for when it came to accommodation. And in that year, later that year, I think it was about October, I met another disabled student on campus. And he already studied for quite a few years and he had some different ideas on what worked. And he convinced me to stay and try again. And then I switched to electronic study material. So basically what we know as ebooks today. And it started going better. It was still very difficult up until about 2015 when ebooks really took off. So what would happen is once again, we would go to the library, take out the books, start typing it over. But at least now I skipped the step where I had to translate it to Braille and start studying the Braille pages, which Braille it's a very slow system. So the nice thing about the electronic system is my computer reads at quite a speed. I think it reads at about 400 words a minute. So I process information much quicker, but learning to go from electronic material or from Braille material to electronic material is kind of like, I think what it was like for sighted people to go from hard copy books to ebooks. It's quite difficult to train yourself to do something different, to learn in a different way. Like all of a sudden from reading with my fingers, I had to go to retaining information by hearing what my computer spoke. So I think those were some of the really big challenges we faced. And then obviously you face challenges like lecturers showing up with a PowerPoint presentation and telling you, if you look at this figure here, but, as a blind person, I didn't know what this figure or year meant. So it was quite difficult to educate lecturers and tutors in the way they taught. So, to remind them constantly that when you have disabled students in your class, it's very difficult for us to follow the conversation if you point to this and that, and I'm expected to figure out what you're referring to. And then obviously also to get the material that lecturers use in class beforehand, so that, going into the class, I would already have studied the material and know what we're going to do today because I can't follow along on the projector. So I think those were some of the really big challenges I faced studying. And some things improved, and some things I think are challenges that students still face today.
Okay, very interesting. So let's just circle back. Why did you decide to study law in the first place?
I've wondered about this over the years. So growing up, I had a very idealistic view about right and wrong, and I understood discrimination from, I think, a far younger age than other students. I understood perception and how if you are perceived different from the rest of society, how it can impact your life. So I think I was always very opinionated on right and wrong and helping the underdog. But I think really what made the decision for me is when I started studying, we were basically encouraged to either pursue life as a switchboard operator. And if you told them, well, this is not what I want to do, I want to go to university, we were told, study music, study law, or study psychology. Those are the things that are accessible, and, those are the things that you can do. And I really think it may have been true at some point back in the past, but I really think we were encouraged to do that more because that's what was been done before. So when I had to make my decision, by that point, I already knew I didn't want to pursue music. My whole family consists of teachers, and I didn't want to follow that route. And my personality and psychology just didn't gel in my mind. So law was kind of the logical choice, considering what I was advised to do and how I saw myself growing up, I think.
That's amazing. It's lovely to hear that you actually had a passion and that you proved everyone wrong who thought that you couldn't study something like law. So,
I think
as
perception is very difficult. Sorry.
yes, no, continue.
So I think perception is one of those things that can change the path that you take for your life. I mean, if a lot of people tell you that you can't do something, it's very difficult to actually start doing it. And law is especially daunting if you consider the amount of study material you have. You have case books and textbooks, and you have practical class experiences where you do, like moot courts and things like that. We have to participate. So it's a very daunting career, or a very daunting path to study, I think. And I really think what's up till today really affects me is how, there's all these stories about we're so proud of disabled people when they make it, when they graduate. But it really wouldn't take that much to remove the obstacles, to make it an equal path for disabled and non-disabled people alike to follow.
That's 100% true. I totally agree with you. And I think a lot of people actually didn't think about it that way. So, as a candidate attorney, how was that experience for you? Did you face obstacles that other people did not face? Did you use your cane? Did you use your guide dog? How did that work?
It was very difficult to actually find a law firm where I could complete my articles. Many times I would apply and I would get to the point where they ask you for your driver's license, and I'd say, okay, but I don't have a driver's license. And some law firms, I know that the LPC recently changed that it can't be a requirement anymore that you need to have a driver's license, but back then it was. So either my CV got automatically thrown out at that point, or they'd ask me, can you obtain a driver's license? And I'd be like, well, I can't see. So that'd be a hard no. And at that point, people would just be like, well, we have never employed a blind person before, and we don't think it's possible. So, no. And I think it was very demotivating. You send out your CV 1,000 times, and 1,000 times people tell you, well, you know what, you've made it through your law degree, but this is where the road ends for you because we just don't believe that it's possible. So finally, it was in the year that I graduated, I think it was December, I took a shot and I phoned someone that I knew and I said to her, I need to find a place to do my articles because I mean, from the day I started studying, that's why you study. You don't study so that you can sit at home and not have anything to do afterwards. It's very demotivating thought. So I said to her, I really need to do my articles. Can you maybe see if your firm will give me a chance? And they called me in for an interview. And before I went to the interview, I printed my LLB dissertation and I took pretty much every bit of technology that I had access to at that stage. And I walked into the office of the director at the law firm who'd make the decision. And I said to him, this is my thesis. This is what I did by myself. I mean, I completed my degree. And I said to him, and here are all the technology, all the apps, everything I use to make life possible. So I said to him, I can sit in a meeting, you can give me a page. I take my phone, I put my camera over the page and I know what the page says. I can use a computer. It went like that. And lucky for me, he was very open-minded, but he was also very interested in the technology. And they said to me, well, you know what, we'll give it a go. Come back in January, we'll put you on probation for a month. So I was very nervous and very excited. And I went back in January. By that point, I had my guide dog for about 3 years or so. So that worked best. The law firm also didn't have any particular problems allowing my guide dog access to the workplace. So I started my articles with them. And after a month, they said, okay, let's register your articles. We think it can work. And it was great because they had the entire system was already based, like cloud-based. So they already moved away from those little brown files that all the law firms are so famous for. Everything was stored in the cloud. They had a completely electronic practice management system. So in that sense, it was the most accessible place that could have happened to me, because when I started with a case, I already had all the information on my computer. It didn't have to be scanned and anything like that. So it was very accommodating in that sense. But I think what was challenging was, again, fighting the perception that disabled people need to be pitied and need to be treated with kid gloves, and that you can't actually do everything that a non-disabled person can do. So I had to fight quite a bit to get assignments that didn't just consist of, do research for me on X, Y, and Z. I think that I really had to constantly say that, I need to do more. Tell me to make bundles, I'll figure it out. Assume that I can do everything until I tell you that, this is not something that I can make accessible, that I can do. So I think in that sense, it was really difficult to assert myself and find my voice as a candidate attorney. And then you also, you look around you and you see what the other candidate attorneys are asked to do. So you kind of start feeling a little bit inferior to your colleagues. And I think that's what makes it very difficult for disabled legal practitioners, is that the law is a very confidence-based field. And once again, it might only be a perception, but I think the more confidence you have, the more secure you feel in your decisions, in your place at the law firm. It's a very competitive career choice. So I think for me, it was very difficult. It was a path filled with obstacles, some that I built up in my mind and some that existed in reality. But I think it made me question what I can do and what I can't do, which was sometimes good and sometimes bad. But I also think it made me start thinking outside the box. So it forced me to sit down and say, well, if I leave it to the attorneys at the law firm, I am going to sit here at my desk and I'm not going to have anything to do. I'm going to answer phones if I'm lucky. So I really had to start getting outside my comfort zone and going to my senior attorneys and sitting in their offices and say, well, you know what, I need something to do. I'm not leaving until, we figure this out. And I think in that sense, it also kind of created, I think, respect and understanding for my situation once other attorneys actually were forced to interact with me. And once they started realizing, that my situation is not that much different from any other candidate attorney. So I definitely think there were numerous obstacles, but I think the greatest challenge that candidate attorneys with especially visual impairments face today is law firms that are not electronic based yet, because that makes it makes a huge difference if you go in and everything is already in a format that you can access.
So, what do you think can the legal environment basically do to make the law more accessible for people who may have disabilities, except for, like you mentioned, having everything in electronic form? Is there anything else they can do to make it more accessible?
I really think that the law as it is already quite accessible. I think where the problem comes in is, again, perception, because there's still very much the idea in our society that, the disability is wrong, that the problem lies with the disability instead of, the problem is with society. So I think the biggest problem that candidate attorneys, especially, or law students who graduate, face is that, where do I go after I completed my degree? Because it's really difficult to find a place to work when everywhere you go, people have this idea that you can't do what you say you can do. You can't do the work. You are not capable because of your disability. So I really think we've been talking a lot about transformation in the LPC, in the legal profession, but I don't think we've spoken enough about transformation where disabled people are concerned. That it's equally important to start saying that disabled people should be employed. That, if a disabled person sends their CV to a law firm, instead of looking at the disability first, look at the CV as you would with any other candidate. Or, instead of working from the premise that what can't this person do, work from the premise that, this person can do everything until, we know otherwise.
That's amazing. So then on that note, I also wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for law students or legal practitioners who may also have a disability?
So I think, although we might have a variety of disabilities, and even visually impaired people, sight is a spectrum. We don't all have the same visual acuity. But I think what's really important is to put yourself out there, to ask questions, to speak up, to read a lot, define your goals. And even if you don't feel confident, it always helps to sell yourself. So when you go in, make technology your best friend, make sure you know of every assistive device out there that could possibly make your life a little bit easier. And then it's really a matter of trying to convince people that you are capable and you are competent. And it's disheartening to think that you always have to prove yourself as a disabled person. But I think as a society, we're not there yet where disabled people are just seen as a normal part of humanity or of, a typical life experience. So it's really important, I think, for disabled people to define their goals, and you have to appear the part. So if you don't look the part, it's already, people already have a very negative perspective of disabled people in general. So you really have to sell yourself.
That's amazing advice. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast, and thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing your story, and also giving advice to others who may be in the same boat. It was lovely to have you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I appreciate it.
So where can our listeners reach you? Are you on social media, on LinkedIn?
So I am on LinkedIn, where anyone can look for me. And if you are a disabled person or a disabled law student or legal practitioner and you'd like to get in touch, I have a community on a group on Facebook called the Savvy Community, or the South African Visually Impaired Community. So you can just look for Savvy Community on Facebook and the group will appear. And hopefully we can answer some of your questions there as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice in Heels podcast. If you like this episode, we would love for you to share it with your friends on social media and tag us. As this is a legal podcast, here is a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are solely the views of the individuals involved and not those of the firms, brands, or anyone else that we are affiliated with. Till next time.